their role in the fur trade. So if anybody is interested, let me know, because I might be able to get us, group ticket rate. I will probably go see that one at some point in February, not during reading week, because I'll be away. So yeah, let me know if you're interested. I'm sorry, I didn't get your reflection from last week, Mark. I fell behind on a lot of things this week. Oh man. I did all kinds of interviews about the impact of Donald Trump on climate change last week, and the last one was Saturday, and I did an hour-long live call-in on CBC Radio nationally. And I do, I've often done these things, but it's just, I'm trying to walk this very fine line between acknowledging the risk and not driving everyone into despair. And anyway, at the end of this 1 hour interview, they hung up, thanks very much, hung up. I burst into tears. I went to bed. And I just stopped working for, most of the rest of the weekend, which I don't usually do. So anyway, I'm behind on everything, and I do blame Donald Trump. And I will continue to blame him, but this one, there's a pretty tight connection there. I will get those back to you today, and the ones that you've submitted today, your ideas for your term papers, I'll evaluate, review those over the next few days, but what I want to do is set up, schedule a meeting with each of you for 20 minutes. And we'll talk about, I'll give you feedback first in writing, and then we'll talk about, how to narrow, in most cases, narrow that down to something that would be more workable in a term paper, or how to develop one of those ideas. And so, I'm thinking I'm waiting to try to schedule some stuff at the BC Climate Council, which, with the threat of Donald Trump, all of these advisory bodies are in overdrive as well. So I'm waiting to hear when some of those things will be scheduled. I'm currently thinking next Friday and Monday. And I'll set aside quite long blocks of time, and I'll figure out how to do a Google form, which I seem to recall last year was pretty easy, but I haven't done it since. So, I'll find one of the neighbor kids who's probably 10 years old to help me do that. Those are not officially, it's not mandatory that you have to meet with me. It will be mandatory that I approve your proposal, which will be due the class before spring break. And honestly, if you will do much better on that, if you meet with me, I can assure you I can be helpful to you. And that is my goal, is to support you and come up with something that will be workable, give you advice on how to study the topics that are of interest to you. Next week, we're going to have a follow-up on the topics we're talking about today: federal provincial relations, Canadian federalism, and fossil fuels and climate. And we're going to look at the proposed but not yet finalized oil and gas emissions cap. Has anybody been following that at all in the news? This is probably the greatest, well, I don't know, maybe tariffs have, but most of the provinces are on board with the federal government on tariffs except Alberta. But the proposed oil and gas emissions cap is probably the greatest irritant right now. And irritants is mild. This is the source of, intergovernmental warfare right now. So how that's going to work is I will post instructions, but I will assign you to represent governments. We're going to call it a First Ministers Conference, but we're going to invite environmental and energy ministers from some jurisdictions. There's some jurisdictions that are likely to have more to say, and I'll accommodate that by having more people come from Alberta, for instance, Alberta and the federal government. I'm thinking BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the feds, Ontario, Quebec. And the other provinces, it kind of depends on, you know, the other possibilities would be one of the Northern Territories, Manitoba, and, you know, there's some interesting stuff going on in the maritime, oh, and Newfoundland, I'm gonna include Newfoundland too, oil producing province. There's some interesting stuff going on in the maritime provinces, I want to study them. So here's, yeah, Tim.
I may have missed this, but is this a simulation we're doing?
Yeah.
Similar to 351?
Yeah.
Okay, and that's
so
next
if
week. I did the CER last year for Manitoba.
Okay, good, because we determined that.
Yeah.
Excellent. Similar thing, we'll do it like the first hour to hour and a half, depends how it's going of the class, and then we'll talk about, you know, was this realistic, what do you learn from it, what does it illustrate about the Canadian Federation. Does anybody, if anybody desperately, well, not even desperately, anybody want to represent one of the smaller jurisdictions? Want to do Northwest?
I'll do the north if we're doing.
Excellent, okay, so, if you can, let's have you be, you're from the Northwest Territories, right? Okay, we'll have you be the Northwest Territories, but feel free to, you know, occasionally bring in insights from your conversations with your colleagues from Nunavut and Yukon. Anybody from the East who wants to be one of the maritime provinces? Any Manitobans here? Okay.
I'd love to represent Manitoba again, though.
Would you? Okay. Tim, you got it. You are Manitoba. Manitoba is an interesting one because,
yeah, it's a simulation.
yeah, Manitoba, I've had various, I've been doing simulations in my Poly 351 class for 20 years, since I created the course. And every once in a while, Manitoba just runs the show. Manitoba just like takes over the simulation and it's really fun to see. So, you know, kind of anything can happen. But Manitoba's, Manitoba's Northwest Territories is important because of the vulnerability, the urgency of action. But, you know, there's some offshore oil and gas up there, so I don't know what you might say. Manitoba Hydro Province, NDP government these days, but a bit unpredictable. Lots of things, so that'll be interesting. Your job in this simulation, and I'll distribute something to give you more information, but basically it is to represent the actual government of the jurisdiction that you are coming to speak for. Not who you wish they were, what you think they would actually say. And on this one, most of them have actually said things as well. Like, do they support this or not? Do they oppose, and why? Do they want changes? So there's gonna be material for you to work with on this one. Let me see. What your reflection assignment for next week is going to be the text of your opening statement, which was probably 1 minute. It's gonna be short, so you can only say so much out loud in 1 minute. I will time you. If you're in the middle of a sentence, when the thing goes off, you should finish your sentence. I'm not gonna say, shut up! But, you know, you might say it out loud and make sure that you're not gonna be cut off halfway through. How are you, any questions about kind of logistics, how it's gonna work? I'll send more of them, but I will give you a link to the federal government's proposal. And that website also includes what they previously proposed. It has, a backgrounder that explains that backgrounders tend to be written in more accessible language. They're for journalists, basically, or regular folks to read. But, the proposal itself will have like a preamble, and you can see what they're saying. Often there's a lot of technical detail in there. In this one, there's some important stuff kind of embedded in. I don't expect you to become engineers, oil and gas engineers overnight, except him. No, I don't. But there's But you can sort of skim over some of those details and still get the gist of what they're talking about. And on this one, the federal government is really kind of taking a new path in defending its policy. Let's see. So I'll share that with you. You're gonna have to do some research on your own. Like, that's gonna be the only reading. There's not any other assigned readings. It's here's a link. Knock yourself out. But you're gonna have to find out what your government's position is, and even for the federal government, how, if you are like the Minister of Natural Resources, how does he talk about this? What's he saying? Because the proposal is, you know, it's like a legal document. It is a, you know, it's not a political speech. Although I was gonna say it's not political. You know, they're all political. This is a very political issue, but it's, you know, it's pretty dry. And so, you know, you want to find out more about what your character is actually saying. You don't have to. Women don't have to. You can use your own name if you want, or you can use the real last name. Actually, let's use the real last names, but you don't have to pretend to be a man if you're not. And so you can use your own gender identity and your own name, first name, but let's use the names of the actual people. How are you going to research your position?
I'd probably go look at their Twitter or their X if they use that, look at news, look at their press conference statements, not necessarily looking at academic sources since things are so evolving.
There won't be any, I'd be surprised if there's any, I'd be very surprised. I would know if there was any academic journal articles in political science on this so far, but there might be some background papers or conference papers or something. So how would you find their speeches and so on?
Oh, I'd probably look at government websites, YouTube, find their Twitter accounts or their official.
Okay. Twitter is, I don't know how much. I mean, it doesn't hurt to check at all. I don't know. I don't know how much politicians are all still using Twitter. You can check Blue Sky, but Blue Sky hasn't yet. I think we're kind of in this in-between zone where a lot of folks are still using Twitter, X, whatever, but not everyone. The government websites often, if you go to the office of a minister or the premier / prime minister, it will often include speeches, links to speeches. The ministry, if you're representing, you know, Ministry of Environment and Climate, Ministry of Energy, will have its own news releases that, you know, state their position. What else?
I personally follow a lot of like climate experts who continuously comment on developments with like these laws and legislations surrounding like emissions cap and like other climate related stuff. They sometimes always give really good breakdowns and are themselves part of different advisory groups, governmental advisory groups as well.
That could be useful if you already know a lot about a subject. If you're a knowledgeable person, you can assess who to follow. One of the things that radio show that I was talking about, that the guy was talking about the rise and impact of misinformation is the rise of influencers. People have a lot of followers, and people assume they know what they're talking about because they have a lot of followers. And I can tell you for a fact that there are lots of people who have a ton of followers on Canadian climate policy who are just full of crap. So I would be very wary of taking that route. I can take it. I can take it. I mean, I feel more comfortable, like I know who these people are, what their sort of scholarly track record is. You know, if there's a debate within the literature, they tend to come down on that side versus that side. And so if they say something, I'm, oh, this is how they're interpreting that. You probably are not in as good a position. And in fact, influencers are just like one of the worst things that's happened to democracy. Because they sound good and they've got lots of followers and everybody assumes they must know what they're talking about. And I say this as, you know, a person with a few, you know, whatever, 2,000 followers. If people really, you know, they should read my published work. They really want to know. But yeah, so that's a bit of a risky strategy for most of you. What else? Yeah.
Like CBC and local news networks, especially if we're dealing with the governance of perhaps more niche locations, just to kind of get a sense of like what's going on, what people are saying in places.
CBC and local news networks, the nice thing about CBC is it's free. So you can do keyword searches on CBC. The other nice thing about CBC is they're actual journalists. This is, you know, they're not experts at everything, although there's like a special CBC climate program, and Laura Lynch is very knowledgeable and asks really hard questions. But they have professional norms. And there is a huge difference between real newspapers and influencers or, you know, Kathy's website, sharing my, you know, curated bits of climate news. So CBC is a good place to start. There are still some print newspapers out there, and they have real journalists. And one of the nice things in a fast-moving area like this, where things are still happening, is that there are still journalists investigating this. There isn't any scholarly literature on it yet. So what they're doing is some of your research for you. The journalists are going out there, they're getting statements from the opposition parties, they are interviewing the minister or the premier, and they will be quoting. Like, that's where the reports on what the position of many jurisdictions is gonna be found. And they kind of know the lay of the land. Who are the environmental groups? What is the, a lot of those stories will also say, this is what our premier is saying, but that's really different than what the other premiers are saying. So real news is really different from a Google search. I discovered too late in last year's course that students had never, a lot of students, I think maybe all of the students had never learned in a course how to do a Boolean search for literature. Do people know what I mean by that? Like and or, okay, we're gonna do that for this. If you wanted to search for news about your jurisdiction's position, how would you do it? So, let me okay, I am in here. There is a database called Canadian Newsstand, which has lots of Canadian newspapers. Curiously, I looked through it last night, and it doesn't seem to have the Montreal Gazette, and I don't think it has Le Devoir. By the way, does anyone speak French? You're gonna be the premier of Quebec, Adam.
Lovely.
That's a fun one.
Yeah, no, I like that. I wrote a paper about Quebec.
Cool, excellent. We're gonna speak in English though,
Okay.
but it just is helpful if you can look at the website.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's see, what am I? Ooh, okay. Canadian Newsstand is a great place to start. It has lots of newspapers, but you could look at the list and see, is there, or you could even, I don't know if you're representing, if you're representing a province, there's gonna be a couple of things. One of them is the national newspapers, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and then there will be kind of a leading provincial newspaper. The local newspapers are really decimated these days, but in the bigger province, there's still important news sources. The Toronto Star would be the biggie in Ontario, the Gazette, Le Devoir in Quebec, in Alberta. I don't know whether, the Edmonton Journal is probably less. The Edmonton Journal and the Calgary Herald would be the two, Vancouver Sun and so on. So, you can select individual newspapers. I think there's spotty coverage of the Quebec ones. By the way, you can get, there's student memberships to a lot of these newspapers that are really cost-effective. Like I have you can get like academic, I don't know if students can as a professor, I pay like $2 a month for the New York Times. And the Washington Post. So there are some good deals out there, even though it's quite expensive to access some of these gated ones if you don't have an academic account. Okay, so let's go into Canadian News Stream. Used to be called Newsstand. Okay, what search terms? Let's just start. Let's just try oil, gas, cap. Oil, gas, cap. Reasonable starting point. Anywhere. 37,000 hits. That's not helpful. What I find a lot in student papers is Google Scholar never search for like serious literature in just Google. Google Scholar, on the other hand, is a potentially useful source of real scholarly, and it, peer-reviewed literature, publications, some conference papers. So there's a huge difference. Like these are not the same thing. Regular Google and Google Scholar. And Google Scholar, and I use Google Scholar. Even then, what I find is students do some sort of, what I'm guessing is happening, is students do some sort of search and then they just go for the first few. Which is a very bad strategy. If you've got a lot of hits, what that means is you've got a lot of crap. And there's no reason to believe, if your search strategy gave you 37,000 hits, there's no reason to believe that the good ones are at the top. You could just be looking at crap. Something about killer whales. I need fending off a big bad, but not good shock. These are kind of recent. They're good. It's recent stuff, but they're not. They're more about tariffs. These are stories that kind of probably mention the oil and gas emissions cap in passing. So what would you do to try narrow that down?
You just add more.
Sorry?
You could go back to the search and add another row of a different, more precise language, I guess,
Okay.
or specify the region that you're looking at.
I did not bring a marker. Okay, so here is where kind of is there one there? Oh, yes. Okay, so since some of you got this behind back, you guys are gonna have something behind your back too. Seminar rooms are not really set up for putting stuff on screen okay, so each one of these circles is a concept. And what you want to do in theory is, sometimes you've got, 3 different concepts, and what you're looking for is at the intersection. a 3 concept. What you wanna do is make the circles as big as possible. Because the bigger the circles are, the more likely you're gonna find the things that are actually in the sweet spot. So, or, the use of the term or in between keywords makes the search bigger, because it's gonna capture things that were said by Kelly or Tim or Ben. Any one of them said something, we're gonna find it. So in that sense, or makes these bigger. If we wanna look for words that were said by Kelly and Tim and Ben, that's gonna narrow it down, because they have to have all said the same thing. So this is these overlap zones, this is the and zone. So typically what we did is we've got something that is probably even too big. Oil, gas, cap, I would, the tricky thing of this one is it's got the word and in it, and I wouldn't want it. You could say, there's 2 ways you can do this, oil, gas emissions cap, because that's the name of the proposed policy. Or if you put an and in there, can you see what I'm doing at the top there where I'm, if you put an and there, you will get things that have, it will probably read it as, you have to have, it'd be like one circle that says oil and one circle that says gas emissions cap, which might be catch you the same thing. The other way you could deal with something like this where, you know, is to put quotations. And then we're looking for exactly that. It's okay, like, it will tell you, if it's capitalized, you'll still get it. But you will have to have those words in that order. That's not a bad strategy, because there's been a lot of stuff written about this particular policy, and that's the particular policy. Let's see, what do we get? Okay, that got out a lot of crap. It probably is getting more recent stuff, because there was a time when this one was called the oil and gas cap, rather than the oil and gas emissions cap, but that was a few years ago. And I'm okay with you looking for ones that are specific to the oil and gas emissions cap. But still, that's 557 results. That's a pretty big circle. I don't expect you to read 557 news stories. That would not be a good use of your time as busy students. How are you going to narrow that down? What's another circle that we could overlap it with to try?
Your province.
Okay, so the way you would do that is, I'm gonna use, I don't think you need this bracket, but I'm gonna include it just to illustrate. If you had, often what you're gonna have is a bunch of, like you might not want to rule out things that just called it the oil and gas cap. You might want to include those as well. And if that's the case, that's still that's circle 1. And I put brackets around that. And then our other circle is going to be, let's see, one of British Columbia. Or BC. Wait, I did that wrong. Jeez, so bad. These are the ors. this is the end. We want those to be big. So there are ors within the two circles. The brackets are the two circles, the two concepts. One of them is the oil and gas emission cap concept. And I've got an or in there because I want it to include both things that specifically say oil and gas emission cap. And I also want it to have oil and gas cap. And it's a bit counterintuitive because we want it to include that and that. But the way to do that is by saying or. So think about, a sentence structure. Ben or Tim. If either one of them said it, it's gonna make it into the circle. Our second circle is British Columbia. But we also, I don't know, maybe a journal talks about BC. So that's one where I'm including another or to make that circle a little bigger. We wanna catch them. And then using an and is telling it, I want the intersection of two circles. I want a little slice that is both about the oil and gas emissions cap and about British Columbia, or says something about British Columbia. Let's see what we get. 110 results. On that one, if I had 110 results, I'd probably just scan through and see if some of them look like garbage. I'm not gonna bother reading them just based on the title, but some look interesting. I, click on the little number at the left and then look at a subset. But to illustrate how else one might narrow this down, especially, and this is specific to a newspaper database. This is not, if you were looking in Google Scholar for scholarly research, which you will be doing for your term papers, and you should not just do a Google search. There may be other databases that a reference librarian would direct you to that would be more useful and more specific to the area you're looking at than Google Scholar. But honestly, I use Google Scholar all the time. In that case, you might narrow it down to publications after a certain year, and they have categories in there, for that you can rule out kind of government reports and, or rule them in, conference papers and that. So you can sort of look at what am I getting here and choose. There's a similar thing going on here down on the left side. First off, we want the full text ones. What the heck? Like, let's read the ones we can actually see what it says. So I'm gonna click on full text. Didn't narrow it down, but it means we're not getting, garbage. Okay, there's newspapers, wire feeds, blogs, podcasts, and websites, other sources. I do not want you looking at, particularly at blogs, podcasts, and other websites. So let's look at newspapers. Include, exclude the blogs, wire feeds. I'm gonna include it, but one of the things about wire feeds is what tends to happen is, do people know what a wire feed is? There's basically a journalism service that broadcast networks or newspapers subscribe to. So in the US, there's AP, American Press, I guess. There's CP in Canada, Canadian Press. And they have their own reporters, and it's basically a subscription service to a bunch of reporters. And a lot of times, what you will see in a story published in a newspaper is the byline will read Canadian Press, or journalists from Canadian Press. And in the old days, if you watch old movies, there would be kind of like a ticker tape coming in, like going and it was the wire feed, and it would be where you got breaking news. And in fact, when I worked at CBS News in their Washington DC bureau in, what year was that? 1984. I think. Okay, so, you know, a long time ago. There was this room, and there was like paper just pouring out of this thing, and, and there was two, I think, there AP, and then there was another wire service, and they would be going tick, 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 just like in the old movies. And it would be the source, like there was, I was writing, preparing some text for the on-air guy to read about this breaking story about, you know, being the US, it was a mass murder at a McDonald's, and, you know, not everybody doesn't have a journalist on the ground in San Ysidro, California. I still remember it. It was really like burned into my mind. And I wanted to know the body count for the lead. And so I was just like standing at these, I was looking through these like little dot matrix printout to try find if any of the wire services had more information for me. So, you know, the thing about getting the wire services as well is that stuff is probably gonna be printed in newspapers as well. So actually, you know what, I'm gonna take it out of there. Because the wire services, you know, if it's an interesting story, the newspapers are gonna pick it up anyway. So I've lost there we go. Okay, we're just gonna look for newspapers. I don't know what other sources are. We're down to 43, fair. Like that would be, you know, pretty easy to look through and see what's there. The view from the oil patch, National Post. You know, a lot of these, it's interesting. They're from the Calgary Herald, the Winnipeg Sun. I bet that's, Winnipeg Sun's pretty small these days. That's probably a wire service. Sometimes it will be the same story being picked up by multiple outlets. Often, and this is going to be useful, there's going to be stories, a lot of these stories are going to lead with Alberta. Because Alberta is leading the fight with the federal government, but clearly it's going to say, and here's what British Columbia is saying, and here's what so-and-so. So in these cases, there's got to be some mention of British Columbia in these stories. So the fact that the headline, one way we could have narrowed it down is by looking for those keywords in the headline, in the title. I worry about doing that in something like this because headline writers write some crazy stuff, and they're not gonna, and they also, just the name of the policy, oil and gas emissions cap, they're not using the right, all those words. So in a journal article, looking for journal articles, that might be more useful. If you're looking for news stories, I wouldn't do that. One other thing I would point you to, in looking at news that students, you know, you can grow up reading newspapers, this is going to be less obvious to you. You could narrow it down probably by dates, but there aren't going to be really old ones here. This is the last few years phenomenon. Okay, you see where I am here? Document type, news, commentary, editorial. In newspapers, print newspapers, also on TV or broadcast journalism, there is straight reporting, and then there is commentary or editorials. And the straight reporting, you know, people, my lefty friends just hate post-media news because because of its screw these things. Wearing hearing aids and a mask is not a good combination. Was I yelling?
No.
Okay. Now that I've taken these out, I sound so quiet compared to what I was beating into my ears. They're like, oh, you know, the newspapers have an editorial slant. It comes through in their editorial page. It comes through in the columnists. But for the most part, these are just professional journalists doing their jobs. So there is a huge difference between the newspaper stories and the columnist. The columnist's job is to be spicy and, you know, and partisan frequently. So there's going to be a whole ton of stuff in Alberta by Dawn Brave, who is a columnist for Calgary, the Calgary Herald? Sometimes, there used to be a Calgary Sun as well. And, you know, those are going to be columns. They're not gonna be the straight news. On the other hand, you know, sometimes they're kind of fun to read because guys like him, Vaughn Palmer in the Vancouver Sun are so connected. They've been doing their column forever. People look to them for inside scoops as well as their political take on things. But if you include the columns, know what you're doing and do not think. And usually it's not always as obvious, but at the end, it'll either say column or opinion at the top or at the bottom. It will say that. And so if there's a byline that is, you know, a columnist, it'll often look like straight news, but it will not be. So be discerning, a discerning news reader. My mother watches MSNBC all day long. She gets up in the morning and she falls asleep to it. And most of what's on, you know, they cover breaking news, and there's, you know, the equivalent of the ticker tape or whatever is like the chyron going across the bottom of the screen, you know, things that are currently. But most of what she watches is columnists who get an hour to, you know, Rachel, I know they calls them all by their first names, like their personal friends. You know, Rachel's on at 9 or whatever. They are the TV equivalent of columnists. It's not straight news. So I encourage you, if you wanna be confident, the news can still be wrong, but mostly these are people who have skills at doing this kind of reporting and who really pride themselves on getting it right. Okay. That's looking for newspaper stuff in particular. The same basic strategies are going to be important to you in doing your research papers, but there you might be looking for news stories, and we'll talk about that depending on what your topic is, but you're presumably also going to be looking for scholarly literature, peer-reviewed academic literature, and there you're going to use the same basically strategy of or statements to make the circles bigger and statements to narrow down the overlap zone. Does that make sense? Okay. Question again. Has that been covered in any of your previous classes? How many yes? More than half. Okay, that's good. There was none last year. But we've also got a bunch of people who have never gotten this in this class as well. So I was quite, I was mortified that this should be in a first year class somewhere. This is not stuff that I should be worried about covering in fourth year. But I'm happy to do it because there's a difference between you have access to real stuff through the library, including real search indexes, as they're called, bodies of literature, bodies of newspaper. If it's gated, it doesn't matter, you can get it as a UBC student through the UBC library. You can go to a particular newspaper and do keyword searches through the UBC library, and just be wary of people who have lots of followers or a blog, or because regular folks on almost every topic, this is when I kind of know some stuff, but on most other topics I don't. And people sound good. Like during the pandemic, there were a lot of folks who sounded good, they might have been medical doctors, but they were just kind of winging it like everybody else with a bit more training, but no research, actual peer-reviewed, systematic research to back up what they were saying. All right, onward. Let's go around, and each of you can share your favorite thing that you're leaning to do your term paper about. Don't go through the whole list of however many topics you came up with, but let's just share one, and we'll see where we all are, maybe give each other some feedback as we go, some advice. And I'm gonna start with Sam, and then we're gonna go this direction.
I think I'm leaning towards more topic which is researching the transferability of oil and gas workers' skills and how that can be used to in different energy industries particularly, and then also researching whether or not different types of energy can be commodified in Canada, and maybe so like to help fill in that void of an economic void for a transfer. So
So can, this is a great topic, by the way, Sam. The skills of workers, or the kind of both, two parts to that. Oftentimes, if you're saying, oh, there's two parts, I'd be like, oh no, pick one of them. This one, they might actually be kind of versions of the same thing that be covered by close, the same articles. Is, do the skills that those workers have transfer, and are there adjacent industries that, the other thing is, transferring it to a whole new industry, or can they just do the same thing to produce a slightly different product?
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Anyone else looking at sort of just transition type, or interested in looking at? It's not just transition, it's related to that, it's the transition. Ish? Okay, we're gonna jump out of line and go to just a.
I mean, I think so. I think it applies, but I was kind of looking at like hydroelectric power, because I wrote a paper on it like last term. I was more closely related to like the soak dam and stuff. But I know that a lot of the power that comes from like those, like a lot of like the dams and like along the rivers in like BC also get that energy kind of gets transferred to the States as well. And so I was wondering about like how feasible like these kinds of energies are once we actually like phase out oil and stuff, because I know that they also that like even like clean energies have their own share of like some pretty heavy emissions and stuff as well, and also like other ecological impacts.
So I'm thinking it's a different topic
Yeah.
than Sam's, but it's another good one. These are like, this is a great topic. I would be wary of, there's kind of, that's one where I would worry about trying to cover both, what are the ecological consequences of hydro and the kind of trade implications. Should we be exporting our hydro? I would think those would be quite different.
Yeah, I was kind of like narrowing it down.
Yeah, so, that's the kind of thing, like, when I read this, I would say, well, there's a lot going on here, you might wanna pick this one, there's gonna be a lot to look at in that alone. Any other thoughts, feedback, expertise from previous courses for either Sam or Justin?
I have thoughts on your paper, Justin, because there's not that much snow in the mountains right now, which means over the summer there's not going to be as much water available, which means that last summer we had to import electricity in BC from Washington State and from Alberta, which is generated using coal. And the whole reason that we had to do that is because we didn't have enough snow to generate hydropower. So it's this kind of terrible feedback loop. I find that very interesting because I work in the snow and think a lot about the snow pattern. Like I think I do. So it's kind of this weird, collision of ecology and economy and international trade, and yeah, that's really cool.
That's really helpful, but one of the other issues that is looming large for hydro, but also for a lot of other sectors, energy production sectors, is how's this all gonna work in a changing climate? I mean, you're looking to these as solutions to climate change, but climate change itself may be undermining the effectiveness of hydro. Coastal nuclear power plants could be another worry going forward. Not for your paper. Katarina.
So I kind of just wanted to focus on the effects of fossil fuels in indigenous communities. And specifically, I wanted to see how indigenous communities have experienced and continue to experience and deal with the emergence and expansion of fossil fuels. By first kind of looking at the colonial story, which has really focused a lot on settler perspectives. So looking at that in terms of a different perspective, but also like seeing the contemporary implications, like the effects of fossil fuels on waterways, food sources, animals, weather and climate. And then seeing the effects of resource extraction through like BC's focus on logging or Alberta's like focus on oil. Like I definitely need to narrow it down, but these are just kind of like ideas that I was thinking of like talking about in the paper. And then also talking about the effects of fossil fuels like from like decades, and then also indigenous activism.
Hugely important stuff, a lot of big stuff
Yeah.
in there. The one thing I'll just say is I'd stay away from the logging. Not that it's not important, but it's not, we're not really, it's not what the subject of this course is. So this would be more fossil fuels, climate, alternate energy, whole other body of literature that we just won't even be touching about impacts of logging. How are you folks thinking about how you narrow down? There's this, Katarina's got this big and incredibly important area of questions about that. How do you figure out what within there?
I actually have a really similar idea to Katarina's, except mine. I'm focusing mine specifically on the environmental human rights impacts of oil sands in Alberta specifically. And I picked two case studies. I'm looking at the Athabasca River and the, I don't know how to pronounce it, the Carroll oil sands. I'm not sure. It's K.
I think curl,
Curl.
but I'm not I mean, it's one of these, do I know that? Or is that just how I always say it?
Yeah, I don't know, but I'm framing it within those two case studies specifically in Alberta, and then I'll be drawing from like the United Nations Environmental Human Rights, and then also Canadian legal bills as well.
So in some ways, Alberta has done a version of this in narrowing it down. It's about oil sands impacts. You picked a particular region and indigenous people, a particular region, and a particular type of impact, contamination of water from a specific project and a specific waterway. That is pretty narrow, but that would work in this case because there's going to be a lot of stuff about that. Oh, and then there's another circle, which is harder to draw, about human rights impacts. It's sort of water as human rights. So there's a bunch of different ways that you're narrowing that down. And it sounds narrow, but it's actually not. It's really big. It's a contentious one where there's going to be lots written, lots of meaty stuff. Mahim?
I had something also similar to those two topics as well. I think mine is slightly taking a different approach. I'm also struggling narrowing it down right now, so I might need some help with that. But
that's my job.
Yeah. So I wanted to focus on because I read about the Western Indigenous Pipeline Group, the group that wanted to buy a stake in the TMX pipeline, and I've also done a couple of other readings that talked about like Indigenous self-determination and how a lot of First Nation groups are trying to take a very different approach from opposing pipeline expansions to actually trying to buy a stake in it, to try to actually accrue the benefits to their First Nation groups, which was sort of my starting point for what I want my topic to be. So like I'm looking into more sources to see how I can narrow that down and talk about like Indigenous self-determination and how they're like sort of changing how they are fighting against this by going on this very vastly different way.
Or just not fighting it,
Right.
embracing it.
Right.
And even along, like we've heard a lot about Indigenous opposition to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We will return to that with some readings later in the course. But there were 6 I think, at the end, First Nations that opposed it and, you know, tried to go all the way to the Supreme Court. There were a bunch of First Nations that signed benefits agreements. Now, what to make of those? Some of the chiefs were quite candid that this is like, this thing's gonna happen anyway, you might as well get some money. But there were some chiefs that were genuinely, this is good for my community. On Indigenous, things about the intersection between indigeneity and fossil fuels and climate change, there's a lot going on there. And they are all incredibly important, and there's a, you know, burgeoning literature and unfortunately, burgeoning examples, you know, high profile examples. So lots, you mentioned a bunch of different things, sort of impacts, historical versus contemporary, forms of opposition. There's, you know, one could distinguish between different fossil fuels. That's one you might, I think, there's kind of different things happening with respect to gas and, I'm gonna come back to gas and oil. So one of the things with a research paper rather than sort of the kind of term papers you might have done before is I want you to dig deeper on something and I want you to do some original thinking on it. As scholars, we do that by narrowing it down so that you're not skimming the surface on everything, but trying to really dig in on a particular question where you can learn more and do your own original thinking. So one of the things I'm gonna do is try to help you do that narrowing down. And you've got lots to work with. Sean?
Yeah, mine is just another kind of on this note. So mine would be like with the natural gas in northwestern BC, and looking at specifically like the Niska and the Haisla nations, and then kind of the response to the above from the surrounding nations, and kind of looking at the different views on the realization of like Indigenous sovereignty and land rights.
So that would be an example where we've got different things going on with respect to oil pipeline and gas, where there was stronger and more visible Indigenous opposition to the Enbridge Northern Gateway proposal, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, both. But we're starting to see, now that it's built, one of them, we are seeing the potential for Indigenous consortia emerging that could try to purchase and operate the pipeline. So something interesting going on there. Quite different thing going on in gas, where there was stronger support all along for gas production and LNG, but we're starting to see more, we're starting to see Indigenous investment in LNG projects and Indigenous-led LNG products. Cedar LNG already approved, C-LISMs in the environmental assessment process right now, but other First Nations opposing it. So there would be a really interesting book to be written about comparing Indigenous opposition or support for oil and gas. I think it would be a lot to bite off as for a single paper in a fourth year course. I'm gonna keep going and we're gonna come to Christine.
Yeah, I was thinking about like water usage and fracking, because fracking takes a lot of water essentially, and I know like some of the, because a lot of it is privately owned, they don't really follow up to code, I think, of to clean water properly and to get it back into the water cycle, so something along.
Yeah, I don't even know if it does, it's just they inject
Yeah,
it
'cause
underground.
but apparently you're supposed to, from what it
They
looks
pump it
like,
back?
they're supposed to clean and put it back, but I
Okay.
don't think it's like, they do it, or they do it up to the amount they're supposed to, or I think the standard they're supposed to clean is very little. So I think it impacts, I mean, like, especially like up north, the water, drinking water, and then agricultural stuff, so.
So this is a different kind of project, which is like, I wanna know more about this thing, everybody talks about it, you know, some people are like, this is the worst, and others just say, don't worry, we've got it under control. That you wanna dig into and find out, what are the different issues, who should we believe, cool. I am open, it's not very political sciencey, and I'm okay with that. It is the kind of project where it's really gonna matter how reputable your sources are. So, you know, I don't wanna see a reference to, you know, YouTube, unless it's an example of the kinds of statements that some people are making. You know, these are the kinds of arguments that are very popular on YouTube, but in fact, you know, are they true? Like, using that as an example of the kind of information that's being shared, but as credible information, no.
One thing I was looking at though is just it's a lot of like news sources, because I feel like it seems like it's decently recent that people are talking about it. So maybe we can just talk privately if there's not as many scholarly sources I fear, but.
Well, one of the things about, I use news to find out what's going on. If I'm studying, you know, sort of contemporary issue, and I get a few things from that. One of them is who are the players, who's saying what. That doesn't tell me whether they're telling the truth or not, or knowledgeable or not, but who are they? Frequently when there's news stories, it's because somebody's released a report. And then you want to go find the report and look at, you know, who wrote this, was it peer reviewed? You know, even among peer reviewed literature, there is frequently a lot of debate. So for instance, there's a lot of debate about whether whether LNG is worse than coal. And environmentalists tend to point to the work by this one researcher who is at one end of that debate and saying, look, the latest research is showing, but in fact, at the same time, there's a bunch of other research that's different. So that would be the kind of thing you'd need to dig into, and maybe even look specifically at BC. Where the fracking is being done in BC, what do we know? Because there could be academic literature and studies elsewhere, depending on the practices that are being used in one place versus another, depending on the depth of how far down they're going. That can have a big implication for things like earthquakes. If you're fracking right below people's houses, it can do weird things. If you're going really far down, it may not have the same impact. So, but yeah, I'm totally open to that kind of study. The approach you take to research is going to matter. I'm going to skip over you, Abida, because you've already shared. Sean, did you already tell us what you were thinking?
LNG.
Right, yes.
BC.
Like, what, 3 minutes ago, and I've already. Sorry about that. Kyle.
Yeah, I was thinking about doing something related to like fossil fuels and like public transportation, I guess, and like potentially like how actors, I guess, like from fossil fuel industries maybe like public transit infrastructure or like development or like lobbyists basically. But then also I was also thinking about maybe like transitioning public transit from like gas and like to like electric vehicles.
Yeah, those would be two different
Right, yeah.
things. The first one brings to mind something that may be relevant to a lot of your projects is, are you going to be able to answer the question in practice? So one of the challenges with things like lobbying that happen behind closed doors is you don't know what they've said. There are lobbyist registries, and depending on the jurisdiction, they have to report who they met with. My guess is those are less common at a local level, and you don't know what that person said. You just know that they met with X. So that can be a hard one to study, and you know there is academic literature on it, but it's probably not going to be specific to this issue. Maybe there is, but in general, so a lot of students in the past have been interested in studying things like mutual benefits agreements that indigenous nations are signing with fossil fuel proponents. That's a hugely important question. Those are not publicly available. So that would be another example where you might have a great question, but are you going to be able to do it based on the availability and confidentiality of data. We've heard from you already. Adam, we heard from you. You had your hand up before.
Yeah, oh yeah, that wasn't my project, that was just kind of popping.
Oh, okay, what's your project idea?
So, kind of how and Christina both said it, I've seen both ends of it. I encountered a blockade in Nishka, kind of the border of Nishka. It was the Kitsan people who were opposed to this pipeline that the Nishka were putting through, the Prince Rupert transmission, something like that. PRGT, yeah, Prince Rupert gas transmission. And that was while I was driving home after having spent the summer living at the other end of the pipe in Fort Nelson, where the fracking takes place. The First Nation is very supportive, and the chief actually is Charlene Gale. She recently got voted out, but is very vocal in saying First Nations need to take a very active role in development, essentially saying, not really saying the quiet part out loud at all, but it's gonna happen, we should get the money, because otherwise they'll keep stealing resources without any benefit to the communities.
Some First Nations have said that.
Yeah.
Quite candidly, and why shouldn't they? You know, it's like.
If it's gonna, yeah, right? So, but what I'd like to interrogate is, is LNG really better than coal? Because there's all these discussions about leaks at the wellhead, and I mean, I walked by a wellhead and got a really bad headache from while I was working there, so I've been around a leak. So it's kind of a question that's in the media already, so I don't know if that's how original it is, especially not hearing other people asking it. But
you would be going beyond the media, looking at actual reports. There are a ton of studies, and they're coming out.
Yeah.
So that would be a sort of similar issue where, what do we know? And yeah, there's lots of noise in the media, and different groups are saying different things based on credible sources. What do you conclude?
yeah, exactly. I'd like to look into production emissions and see, I mean, there's kind of two talking points. There's the pro-development talking point that production emissions aren't actually that bad for gas, and we should replace coal with it. And then there's the anti-production, and this is a different area, but about emissions caps, saying that an emission cap won't actually affect production and we should go ahead and do it. And then the
I would
provinces.
say that's a separate question.
Okay.
We'll talk more
Yeah.
about that.
So I'm a little all over the place.
Yeah, but yeah, that's okay. You all are at this point. Justin, we already heard from you, unless you feel like we covered what you want to say.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Over to you, Ben.
Originally, I was thinking about doing something about Canada's economic future in relation to oil and gas and sort of possible investments, even though it's a
Canada's
declining.
economic future as like a generic thing, or there's an annual report called, oh no, that's Canada's energy future. Never mind. CEF.
But then, so I was thinking about doing something about that and kind of investing in oil and gas despite like trying to turn away from it. But then last week, the video that we watched, kind of about the girl dancing in the oil sands, of really struck me. So then like the last couple of days, I've been thinking about doing something about sort of how the media represents the oil and gas industry and how that's changed over time, and sort of how that's shaped like the public's perception of oil and gas, and maybe like over time, and then also kind of cross-regionally, like how in some areas it's perceived in this way, in some areas it's represented in this way. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of leaning towards that now.
They're both great topics, lots to work with. On the latter one, there's a lot of research, public opinion research, there's communication scholars who are looking at how the industry is discussed. So even there, we might need to narrow it down a
I was
bit,
wanting to meet
but
with you about that.
there's
'cause
there's lots of material.
I still need to flush that one out, but yeah.
Cool, love it. Tim, oh yeah,
I was gonna say something. If you still kind of want to do like the future of oil and gas, you can also kind of look at your media thing as like a past, present, future, and kind of maybe based on what you are seeing or based on the trends that you discover, what do you think the future representation of oil and gas is going to look like in the media? That would be something as well.
although I think I'm gonna, speculation about what's to come, let's leave that to the last paragraph. Because I don't wanna see papers that are all about you predicting the future, because none of us are gonna be very good at that. What you can do is try to understand what has happened between past and present, and then think, well, what are the implications of what I now know for what might happen in the future? But that's not gonna be the body of your paper. And in fact, one of the challenges of working in this space is, everybody's like, so what's gonna happen? And, I don't know. But, you can provide a more informed musing on that at the end of a paper. And I'm open to that. You can have some personal musings at the end. Tim?
Yeah, I'm thinking of looking into how responsive provincial governments or governments are to the changing priorities of Canadians or British Columbians or whatever I choose to do. So like how people's rankings of environment or climate change is changing over time based on opinion polling data and maybe Hansard. And I feel like fossil fuels would be pretty central to this investigation since they're key in what politicians say about environmental policies.
That's kind of the $64 million question right now. We are seeing it in real time play out in front of us. This morning on my drive-in, there was a clip of David Eby. Now it's just a clip, so I don't know what the rest of the speech was, but talking about the importance of British Columbia diversifying its exports, given the threat from the U.S. That could mean a lot of things. I interpret that as this government being pretty open to approving additional LNG terminals to get, if the U.S. doesn't want our gas, let's find some other way to get our gas off to other markets. This is someone who, when he was seeking the leadership, said you can't fix climate change by just producing more fossil fuels or something to that effect. So this is a great topic where there has been change and where there's an interesting possibility of Tim doing some original research, but this is just a term paper. So to do that might involve narrowing down, okay, to one jurisdiction, to a period of time, and looking at one source of politician speeches, maybe in Hansard, and sort of looking at what are they saying in the legislature, possibly even just what our government voice is saying and how has that changed or something like that. So there are ways to, no scholar gets to answer all the big questions in a single paper. We pick off bite-sized pieces and then build a career by doing them one at a time. And those bite-sized pieces can give important insights for the next study. So I love that idea, Tim. Keen to talk more. Kelly.
So from the past weeks of studying, I found out that federal government and provincial government cannot easily reach a consensus on the resources distribution. And so one topic I would like to research is that the feasibility of nationalizing Canada's resources. Nationalizing, yeah, more centralizing Canada's resources. The obstacle now has been different from what is happening in 1970s about the oil crisis. It's also the end of the globalization kind of fading. Also the end of international trade. So it is better for Canada to control and nationalize the resources and doing more intranational trade between provinces.
That one, there's a couple parts. One of them was sort of nationalizing, which I would interpret as the federal government taking control of natural resources. And the other part was about promoting more interprovincial trade within Canada. The latter one I think is a doable project and more feasible. You might look specifically in oil. We're importing foreign oil in the east, and then most of the Western oil is being exported. One of the big questions is always, why aren't we using our own oil in the east? If the U.S. doesn't want it, why we're importing U.S. oil in the east and exporting in the west. The nationalizing natural resources is one we could revisit after talking about the readings today and after like witnessing our little simulation next week, but that's one where I think, good question, important topic, that's just never gonna happen in this country. And I, as a person who studies Canadian politics, can like advise, like maybe if there's, you know, a war or climate change gets so bad, we're rebuilding our constitution or something, but in our current scenario, one of the things that comes through in the readings is how strongly provincial governments fight to retain their ownership of those resources. What doesn't come through in the readings that I can share with you is that Canada needs support of, the federal government can't just revise the Constitution. To change who owns the natural resources would require the constitutional amendment. That comes through a bit on the section 92A stuff from the one reading. So that's one where, important question, intriguing thing to look into. I might help steer a student to a topic that is related to that and more doable, like why did it end up like this? But I can draw on my own, knowledge from working in this field to help you avoid a dead end for a topic that's just not, that isn't gonna go anywhere. So that's, one of the other purposes of those meetings is I can, say, here's, this could be more workable than that one. So, great stuff we covered everyone, right? We started with you. I'm like pretty dopey today. Okay, we spent a bunch of time on this for a few reasons. One of them is for you to hear the interesting stuff that you're all doing, for me to give you some feedback on the challenges that are common that you're all gonna face, how to narrow things down, what approach to take, how to do the actual research, what's gonna be feasible and not, thinking about confidentiality of sources. So things that are gonna come through in that I want to be able to share with the whole group rather than just one-to-one. But also, you now know kind of what some of your fellow students are looking at. And if there are overlaps, talk to each other. Share, if there's some interesting development in the news, something that you've come across that might be relevant to one of your fellow students' work in this course. Talk about it. Outside class, grab each other at the coffee break, and so on. Okay, that took a lot longer than I intended, but we have the whole rest of this class, and we've got all next week on federalism too, because I've spent, 35 years working on it. So I could go on about federalism. Let's just take a break now and then start fresh at 10.